Welcome, dear viewer. I am Eli, and the night has already fallen. Grab your favorite drink and tuck yourself under your blanket. It's cold outside. Turn off all the lights around you. Let the world buzz far away. Come and sink into the depths with me. For as I always say, truth is always stranger than fiction, and the darkness is always deeper than what your eyes can see. Stay with me. The story has begun. The woman behind the story says, I am Sarah, and I believe that photos don't just capture moments, they steal the souls of places. As a wilderness photographer, I've spent half my life in locations people fear to even mention in bedtime stories. But this time, it was different. I was chasing the blood moon, a phenomenon that makes the sky look as though it's bleeding over our heads. To get the perfect shot, I had to go to the Midnight Forest. It's a forgotten geographic spot, fallen off tourist maps and human memory, located in the far north, where the trees are as ancient as the earth itself. Before leaving, I was at home, amidst the city noise I loathed. I sat with my mother in the kitchen. A lamplight flickered over the dining table. My mother, with a heart that senses danger before it strikes, held my hand with unusual strength. Sarah, this forest is not like others. My grandfather used to say the trees there have ears, and the winds don't blow in vain. I laughed then, kissed her forehead, and assured her I'd be fine. I left her at home, in that safe zone, 8 full hours of driving away from my destination. That was my last encounter with logic and the world I knew. I set off in my SUV at dawn. The road gradually narrowed, and buildings faded to be replaced by an endless strip of dry brush. As the hours passed, the phone signal weakened until it vanished completely. I was alone with the sound of the engine. I reached the end of the paved road, where a weathered wooden sign stood, reading in faint script, "Do not cross this limit after sunset." I paid it no mind. A true photographer knows no boundaries. I set off in my SUV at dawn. The road gradually narrowed, and buildings faded to be replaced by an endless strip of dry brush. As the hours passed, the phone signal weakened until it vanished completely. I was alone with the sound of the engine. I reached the end of the paved road, where a weathered wooden sign stood, reading in faint script, "Do not cross this limit after sunset." I paid it no mind. A true photographer knows no boundaries. I parked my car and carried my heavy gear on my back. I had to hike 4 kilometers deep into the forest to reach the desired ridge. The moment I stepped among the trees, I felt a sudden change in atmospheric pressure. The air grew heavy, and the stench of dampness and rot was suffocating. The trees here weren't natural. Their trunks were twisted painfully, as if they were creatures tortured before freezing in place. The branches interlocked above me to form a natural ceiling, blocking out the sunlight entirely, making time feel as if it had stopped at an eternal twilight hour. Silence was the true protagonist in those moments. I didn't hear a single bird, nor the rustle of a squirrel. Even the insects seemed afraid to make a hum. The only sound was my boots crushing dry branches beneath my feet, a sound that echoed strangely, as if someone were walking right behind me, stopping when I stopped, and moving when I moved. I looked back repeatedly, but I saw nothing but the grey mist creeping between the trunks. I reached a small clearing, a gap in the heart of the forest that allowed a view of the sky. There, I pitched my tent. I was tired, but my photographer's instinct warned me that something wasn't right. I began setting up my camera, placing the tripod, and aiming it toward the peak. As I was adjusting the lens, I noticed something in the corner of my eye. A massive pine tree, about 10 meters from my tent, seemed closer than it was a minute ago. I shook my head, thinking it was just exhaustion from the long journey. Night fell quickly, a pitch-black darkness broken only by the small headlamp on my forehead. I entered my tent and zipped it tight. The forest chill began to seep through the fabric, a cold that wasn't natural. It felt like ice on burnt skin. I lay in my sleeping bag and tried to close my eyes, but suddenly I heard that sound. It wasn't wind, and it wasn't an animal. It was a very faint sound, like the friction of skin against tree bark. A very slow, dragging sound approaching my tent. I froze, gripping my small knife with trembling hands. The sound stopped exactly at the back wall of the tent. I felt a slight pressure on the fabric, as if a head was leaning against the tent from the outside, trying to sense my body heat within. I stayed like that for hours, not daring to breathe loudly. At that moment, amidst that deadly silence, I heard a whisper that made my heart stop for a second, a whisper that should have never come from that forest. It was the sound of human breath, with a very familiar tone. "Sarah, are you awake?" My limbs shook. That voice, it couldn't be. It was my mother's voice. But how? She is 8 hours away in her home. She doesn't even know my coordinates. The voice was coming directly from behind the fabric. It was warm and tender, but it carried a strange ring, a metallic or wooden echo at the end, as if a machine were trying to mimic human affection. "Sarah, open up. It's so cold out here. I'm lost, Sarah." I remembered my grandfather's advice. The trees have ears. I realized I had made a grave mistake coming here. The forest wasn't silent because it was empty. It was silent because it was listening. It was listening to my last call. It was stealing my mother's tone from the memory of the air. And now, something is standing behind my tent, something that isn't my mother, something using my most precious possession to lure me out into the darkness from which no one returns. I remained paralyzed in my sleeping bag, as if moving a single inch would grant this thing permission to violate me. My mother's voice still echoed behind the fabric, but it wasn't a natural voice as I first heard it. There was a slight lag in the words, as if the speaker were practicing pronunciation for the first time. "Sarah, it's cold, open. It's cold, open." It repeated the phrase at the same pace, exactly like an old recording skipping on a needle. I tried to regain my logic. My mother suffers from knee pain. It's impossible for her to hike 4 kilometers through this rugged forest, and impossible for her to find my spot in this pitch-black darkness. She who gets lost on the way to the nearby supermarket. This isn't human. This is something else. I reached out very slowly toward my camera bag. I needed the powerful flashlight, but I feared the light might reveal my location more than protect me. Suddenly, the voice stopped. A heavy silence fell, so profound I began to hear the ringing in my ears. Then I heard a scratching sound, the scratching of nails, or perhaps dry branches, sliding along the outer surface of the tent. It moved slowly from back to front, heading toward the zipper. I felt an indescribable terror, the kind that freezes your limbs while your heart wants to jump out of your chest. The scratching suggested that the entity outside was feeling the shape of the tent, trying to figure out how to open this cover. "I know you're in there," the voice said suddenly. This time, it wasn't my mother's voice. It was my voice. Yes, it was an exact echo of my tone when I'm afraid. A chill ran down my spine. The forest doesn't just mimic those we love. It has begun to steal me too. In that moment, I made my decision. I wouldn't stay here waiting to be crushed inside this tent. I grabbed the camera, set the flash to the highest level, and readied the emergency flashlight. With one swift motion, I pulled the tent zipper and jumped out, repeatedly pressing the flash button to blind anything standing before me. The powerful white light cut through the darkness like knives, but the shock was in what I saw. There was no one. The space in front of the tent was completely empty, but the trees were different. The tree that was 10 meters away was now only 2 steps away. Its roots were protruding above the ground like legs preparing to pounce. I looked around the tent in bewilderment. The mist was wrapping everything, but I began to notice faces in the tree bark. Not real faces, but wooden protrusions masterfully formed to resemble human features in a state of screaming. I started to run. I didn't care about the gear. I didn't care about the tent. I just wanted to reach the car. But the forest I had entered hours ago wasn't the forest I was running in now. The paths had vanished. Every time I looked at a tree for guidance, I felt it moving behind me to block the way. I heard voices emerging from the trunks, muffled laughter, and voices calling out names I didn't know, perhaps previous victims of this cursed land. I stopped to catch my breath, leaning my back against a massive tree trunk. Suddenly, I felt something slimy and cold touch my neck. It wasn't a branch. It was soft bark that began to slowly wrap around my shoulder. I jumped away screaming and aimed the flashlight at the tree. The trunk was slowly opening, as if a large crack were widening, and from within that crack a black substance like tar began to emerge, smelling like rotting meat mixed with old earth. From the midst of that blackness, a hand emerged. It was a wooden hand, its fingers long and pointed like needles, but it moved with strange flexibility. That hand began to touch the ground, followed by another. The entity was emerging from the heart of the tree, as if being born from it. It had no clear face. It was a mass of intertwined branches and moving bark, but in the center was an opening like a mouth, from which my mother's voice emerged with deadly clarity. "Why are you running, Sarah? Don't you want to see me?" I began to retreat, the entity advancing toward me with heavy steps that made the earth shake beneath my feet. It wasn't running. It was walking with the confidence of one who knows their prey has nowhere to go. In that moment, I realized the forest isn't just a collection of trees. It's one large neural network, and every tree is an appendage of this monster. I aimed the camera at it again, not to take a picture, but to use the live view screen. They say cameras see what the naked eye cannot. Through the screen, I saw the hideous truth. The entity wasn't one. There were dozens of them, emerging from every tree around me, surrounding me in a closing circle. They all wore distorted features of people I knew, my neighbors, old friends, even my father who died years ago. The camera fell from my hand, its lens shattering on a jagged rock. The darkness began to swallow my weakening flash. The roots, wrapping around my ankles, weren't pulling with violent force. They were slithering with a terrifying softness, like cold silk threads numbing my skin. I tried to scream, but my voice came out hoarse, dry, as if my throat had filled with sawdust. I looked up at the narrow circle of sky that the mist was starting to close off, and I realized the forest was no longer allowing me to see the stars. The entity carrying my mother's distorted face stopped inches from me, leaning its twisted wooden body, and I heard the cracking of its joints, like branches breaking under the weight of a storm. "Don't fight, Sarah," the voice said, and this time it was a terrifying mix of my mother's voice, my own, and a wind howling in a narrow passage. "The earth doesn't lie. The earth takes what it gives." I felt the pressure of the roots increase, and I began to sink into the damp soil which turned into a swamp of black mud. My hand, which was feeling the ground for an exit, sank into a sticky substance, and when I lifted it, I saw that my fingers had begun to take on a dark green color. Not paint, but my skin cells were transforming before my eyes into a layer of bark. The terror didn't stem from pain, I felt no pain, but from the calm. I was losing sensation in my limbs, and coldness began to settle in my heart. I thought of my room, the smell of coffee in the morning, the city traffic I used to hate. All those memories began to look faded, like old photographs left under the sun until their features were lost. The forest was erasing Sarah the photographer to write in her place a new tree in its eternal record. With a final effort, I remembered the matches I kept in my camera vest pocket for emergencies. My hand was heavy, wooden, and I could barely get my stiff fingers into the pocket. I pulled out the matchbox. It was slightly damp with the forest scent, but I began striking the matches frantically. 1, 2, 3, nothing. At the moment the entity touched my forehead with its pointed fingers, the fourth match ignited. It wasn't just a small flame. To me, it was the greatest light I had ever seen. I brought the flame close to the roots wrapping around me. The trees screamed. Yes, the forest screamed with a collective voice that shook the ground. The roots suddenly retracted, as if hit by an electric shock. This thing, the entity mimicking my mother, recoiled and shook violently, its wooden face beginning to crack and emit sounds like burning green wood. I seized those seconds of chaos and rose with a body that felt as if it weighed tons. I ran in one direction, without thinking, without a compass, just away from that sound. I was tripping over roots trying to trip me, and slamming into trunks that were closing in to block my path. The fire in my hand went out, but I didn't stop. I heard behind me the sound of an entire forest breaking as it chased me, the collective slithering of thousands of trees that had decided this prey would not escape. Suddenly, without warning, I slammed into something cold and metallic. It was my car. I couldn't believe my eyes. It was completely covered in branches and leaves, as if the forest had tried to digest it too. I inserted the key into the lock, with a hand shaking so much I almost broke it. I got into the car and started the engine. The engine screamed at first, then roared to life. I sped off at full speed, smashing through the branches, obstructing my path, and I never looked back. I drove for hours in total silence until the first threads of dawn began to appear, and until a phone signal gradually returned. I stopped at the first gas station, stepping out of the car, staggering. I went into the restroom and stood before the mirror. I splashed my face with cold water repeatedly, then raised my head to look. It was me, Sarah, but something had broken forever. I looked at my wrist, where the layer of bark had begun to appear in the forest. The skin had returned to normal, but when I ran my hand over it, I didn't feel the softness of human skin. I felt a slight roughness, as if a layer of wood were growing beneath my pores, and more importantly, the silence. I no longer heard the city sounds. I no longer heard the car noise. All I hear now is a faint whisper, coming from afar, from the north, my mother's voice calling clearly, "Sarah, you forgot your lens there. Come, take it." I am now in my home downtown, but I never open the windows. I'm afraid of seeing the trees in the public park. I'm afraid of the rustle of leaves in the autumn, because I know the truth. The forest doesn't chase you with feet. It plants itself inside you. And now, every time I look at my hand in the moonlight, I see the veins beneath my skin slowly turning green. I didn't escape the midnight forest. I just took it home with me.